Hi there, 8th graders. This is Chapter 19 in History, Section 1, Part 1. These are lengthy sections, so I don't want to run out of time, so I'm going to divide each of these into two sections. This video will be pages 578 to 580. Do follow along. Section 1, World Affairs, 1933 to 1939. This sets up what was going on in the world before the outbreak of World War II. The main idea of this section, as the United States worked to pull itself out of the Great Depression, Europe again moved toward war. In this section, we will discuss how the Depression influenced American foreign policy and the reasons for Japan's aggression in Asia. Before I start, this is a big chapter. World War II is a war that encompassed most of the world. And the effects of this war are still being felt around the world today. There is so much more that's not in this chapter. This chapter merely scratches the surface of what happened during World War II. So I do encourage you, if you are interested in any part of this, do some more reading. There are lots of movies, videos. You can find out about individual people, individual battles. Look into that if you are interested. It's a fascinating time of our history. Like I said, this just scratches the surface. Page 578. Like his distant cousin Theodore, Franklin D. Roosevelt was acquainted with the world beyond the shores of the United States. He had made more than a dozen trips to Europe, and he had first-hand knowledge of the Caribbean area. Through family connections with the China trade, he had acquired an interest in Asia. He resembled Theodore Roosevelt, too, in realizing that as a world power, the United States had a commitment to help preserve the peace of the world. As a former associate of Woodrow Wilson, he believed in world organization to promote international cooperation and to solve disputes. For most of his first two terms, however, Franklin D. Roosevelt focused on domestic affairs. Now remember, domestic, that means here at home. Events in Europe and Asia seemed distant when compared to the crisis of the Depression. In addition, the president recognized that Americans, pressed by hard times at home, cared little about the world at large. So although Roosevelt believed that German expansion posed a threat to the United States, he was cautious in his efforts to alert the nation to this danger. Only when dealing with affairs in the Western Hemisphere did Roosevelt act with his typical, bold political style. New Deal foreign policy. At his first inaugural in 1933, President Roosevelt pledged that the United States should be a good neighbor in the family of nations. He pledged to respect the sovereign rights of all nations in the Western Hemisphere. A few weeks later, he applied the phrase good neighbor specifically to the administration's Latin American policy. Peaceful intentions in Latin America. President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull worked to improve relations with the United States' southern neighbors. Later that year, at the Pan American Conference in Montevideo, Uruguay, the United States agreed to a resolution that no state has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another. Roosevelt demonstrated his commitment to the good neighbor policy by recalling American troops from Haiti and Nicaragua, where they had been protecting American property since the 1920s. When Cuba erupted in revolution in 1933, Roosevelt used diplomacy, not troops, to help restore order. When Mexico seized American-owned oil companies in 1938, Roosevelt resisted demands for military action and sought a peaceful settlement. Domestic recovery determines foreign decisions. During Roosevelt's first years in office, the United States seemed less inclined to cooperate with Europe. The New Deal adopted a policy of economic isolation, and its recovery programs included attempts to solve agricultural and industrial production problems without considering the rest of the world. In 1933, delegates from more than 60 nations met in London to bring about cooperation in confronting world depression. Roosevelt wrecked the conference by rejecting proposals to peg the value of the dollar on any other currency. He feared that such a move would hurt his efforts to raise American farm prices. Only when the U.S. had achieved some recovery from the Depression was the president willing to consider economic cooperation with other nations. Secretary of State Hull believed world prosperity and goodwill could be gained by reducing tariffs. At Hull's urging, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, allowing the State Departments to make treaties with other countries to mutually lower import duties. Within 6 years, the U.S. had reached such agreements with more than a dozen nations. Recognition of the Soviet Union. Another change in foreign policy took place when the U.S. recognized the government of the Soviet Union. Since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, that's an interesting world event in itself. Actually, more Russia, but a really interesting event. The United States had refused to recognize the communist government. After their revolution, the Soviets tried to encourage communism throughout the world. By 1933, however, the USSR was beset by serious economic problems at home and seemed less a threat. Much more threatening was the rising power of Japan, the Soviets' rival in Asia. The president hoped a strong Soviet Union could slow Japanese expansion. In addition, Roosevelt saw the Soviets' need for food and industrial equipment as a market for American farmers and manufacturers. The United States would probably recognize the devil, Will Rogers joked, if it could sell him pitchforks. Recognition of the Soviet Union helped improve relations, but did little to increase trade or to check Japanese militarism. Thanks for listening.